Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Dr. Fantastic Interviews. I'm sitting in Mission Bay, is it Mission Bay? Pacific Beach, at the edge of the continent, overlooking the ocean with a gentleman that's quite astute. And we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve Bank and the IRS. What was the date on that one?
Well, the Federal Reserve Act and the IRS Act were both passed unanimous at the same time, December 23rd, 1913. It was done on Christmas Eve with a minority of the Congress, while the rest of Congress was at home with their families, celebrating the holidays. They were able to railroad these acts through. President Wilson at this time said that he unknowingly gave up the United States to a group of dominant men. And the Federal Reserve is not a public bank. It's not a United States bank. It's no more federal than Federal Reserve. Because it's so private, nobody's allowed to audit the Fed. Not in its entire existence have we done a complete audit. Not the president, not Congress, not even GOD is allowed to audit the Fed. But all this...
You said the IRS was signed at the same time.
The IRS Act was signed exactly at the same time. They're both created at the same exact time, but you have to think about the reasons why the Fed has control over the money supply. Their existence was supposed to stabilize the economy and the money supply, but it's done the opposite. It's actually responsible for the boom-bust cycles that we've had over the last 106 years. All this going on in the world, 2020, March 21st, start of the quarantine, or the so-called lockdown, until now, you have a rapid expansion of the money supply, the printing of magic monies, and stimulus checks is more prevalent than ever. But it's a sign that the system is speeding up this magic money because it's losing control. Every single country that has tried fiat currency has collapsed. So we are no different. The way we can get back to a more stable economy is to go back to real money, which is something based on the gold and silver standard. People like Ron Paul have been talking about this for years. Even the Fed chairman, Greenspan, Alan Greenspan, has been talking about it for many years. Before he became chairman, he was all for a gold standard, but later he changed his tune and became part of the Federal Reserve System. But on a positive note, if you were to acquire gold and silver and other precious metals, you would have a better store of value than you would in Federal Reserve notes.
Paper.
Well,
I heard they're dismantling it, though. I have a rumor that's coming down the pike. They might be dismantling it.
Well, they could be going to what's called a cryptocurrency, but controlled by the Fed.
Yeah, see, I believe in the digital currency. The only problem with that, it's all based on electricity. And without electricity, we're all broke.
Well, computers read in ones and zeros. So if you're going to trust your life savings to a computer that has ones and zeros, you may be surprised to look at your bank statement one day and see that those ones and zeros have changed to all zeros.
All zeros, yeah.
Overnight.
Yeah, and we have no control over it.
No control.
The government's controlling everything.
So those...
Or the money people. I wouldn't say the government. I would say the big families, the Bilderbergs, the Rothschilds.
These main wealthy families you're talking about that control most of the world's wealth, they are what's known as old money or elites. They have been consolidating money and power for many generations, so they have hundreds of years on the average person. So basically, what we're going to have to move toward in the future, if you want any kind of store of value, is something more of a precious metal or even hard goods is what I invest in, real property. That way you can even... Something tangible, something you can trade, even if it's going back to the old barter system.
Well, Fiji, as I went to Fiji on my trip there, it just went back to the barter system because of COVID and nobody had any money. So they're trading 3 chickens for a gallon of gasoline.
There you go. So
it really works well, the barter system.
The old barter system is not perfect because you can't make exact change, but it gives you something tangible to trade with rather than fiat currency or electronic ones and zeros.
What do you mean by fiat currency?
Fiat is a currency that's not tied to anything. For example, we were on the gold standard back before, I believe it was 1972, when Nixon took us off the gold standard. And fiat is basically the nation's currency backed by the full faith and credit of the country, not anything else. When you have to have gold or silver backing it, you have to actually have the reserves, which makes it a non-fiat currency. It's not floating. So thank you, Nixon, for taking off the gold standard, but I'm sure he had help from a lot of his advisors, whoever they may be. But we've had the energy crisis in the late 70s that I could only hear stories about. The savings and loan crisis in the 80s will, of course, go back to the Great Depression. Not more than 15 years after the creation of the Federal Reserve, we had the greatest depression the country has ever seen. Isn't that something? And if you follow the history of the Great Depression, which we are in now, we're actually in the greatest depression, we just don't know it yet. So once this magic money dries up, the real damage will be seen to the economy. But 1920, late 20s, 29, what happened after all the Great Depression? We entered into an era of bigger government, more expansion of powers, more social programs. You had Social Security was adopted around the late 30s. And Social Security is one of those things, if you break up the term Social Security, it's meant to provide some kind of a safety net for people who don't have the means, either through retirement or disability, to take care of themselves. Whereas in the past, people's Social Security was reliant on how many children they had. Children were their form of security for retirement.
Especially farmers.
Exactly. Especially farmers and people who had to work the land. So when the Social Security was being adopted, it was coming from a fear that the people had when everything was breaking down, soup kitchens and long lines of people trying to even feed themselves, which we're seeing now with this whole pandemic that they've launched on the world. You have food banks being overwhelmed and just lines that are going on for a long time. And this has only been 2 months into this thing. The Great Depression dragged on for years. So we are at a more critical juncture than we were even then. But the Social Security Act was pushed in around 1933, supposedly as a consequence to the Great Depression. When it was being enacted, some of the Congress members who were there when the bill was being signed asked, "Isn't this socialist security?" And the other proponents of the bill would say, "This is not socialist." And the other congressmen who were the opponents were saying, "Isn't this just a little bit of socialism?" Not even a little bit. It's not socialism. Whenever an idea is so good that you have to force people to do it, it is socialism. Only when it's a voluntary system where people have a choice to opt in or opt out, it is freedom and liberty, which is the antithesis of the socialist system. So we have to be hyper aware today of creeping socialism and communism in the United States and the world as this emergency continues to drag on many months after the initial goalpost of 100 yards was established.
I have a question for you. You've got a lot of knowledge and you're very well spoken. Having this knowledge, do you think makes it you happier or sadder? Because a lot of people don't know what you're talking about, and so they're ignorant to it. And sometimes you might say ignorance is bliss, because like Fukushima as an example. You know about Fukushima?
Yes.
Well, most people don't, and it's the ELE, extinction level event, that's occurring, but people don't know about it. So sometimes it's maybe better not to know that this is 70% irradiated, this ocean we're looking at right here.
Well, maybe the hippies were right in the 60s when they started building all these nuclear power plants on top of earthquake faults. They knew something that the politicians refused to acknowledge, even if they knew it. In California, we have 2 nuclear power plants built on faults, just like Fukushima.
Well, that was built. The problem with that one was they put the backup generators in the basement. So when they had this tsunami come through, where does water go? The lowest point.
Water seeks its own level.
Exactly. So these idiots who designed the plant put the backup generators, which you have to have if you lose electricity from an earthquake or whatever,
below the sea level.
Below sea level, and that caused 8 year. It's been 8 years now. 100,000 gallons of radioactive material every single day flow into the ocean.
Yeah, it's probably more in the millions of tons of acre feet of water now.
But now, when they build, I actually interviewed a guy who knows about the tanks. They build a $1 million tank it's a $2 million tank every day they build, and it holds 1 million gallons of the really bad irradiated. So there's a whole island full of these tanks that they build every single day and fill up with the bad radiation. And it's not even welded. It's got obviously seals with bolts, but every day they have to do this, every single day.
Well, it just puts it into perspective of how expensive nuclear energy actually is.
All green energy, if you think about it, it took more carbon energy to create the panels and the sun shields and all the technology. I've looked at them all, and it takes more carbon energy to create that than you get benefit from the discount in a few cents in the technology.
Well,
we're trying to go forward,
right.
But we're stepping back.
Well, yeah, putting that into perspective, in California, we have 2 nuclear power plants. One is San Onofre, which is not too far from here. It's just north of here. It's built on an active fault. They shut down several years ago because they found cracks in the reactor tubes, and the contractor installed them in reverse. So there was a couple of mistakes, and there was a leak. They also have another nuclear plant up north called Diablo Canyon, which is also built near an active fault. Because California and Japan...
Well, there's faults everywhere.
There is.
It's not their fault, by the way.
Yeah. Well, there's minor faults and there's major faults.
I know, I'm joking. Yeah.
So a major fault is what's called the Ring of Fire. And we have the Ring of Fire that goes all the way through Japan,
right,
up to Alaska, back through the Cascadia region, down to California. So knowing that we have these major faults near nuclear power plants, it's only a matter of time if we have a disaster similar to Japan's.
Yeah.
So we have to put that into perspective.
Yeah.
But to answer the other question that you asked me, if about the positive and negativity, I don't consider myself a pessimist, and I don't consider myself an optimist. I consider myself a realist. If something is happening that is negative, I handle it accordingly. If it's something positive, I also handle that accordingly. But I look at the real, not how you wish it to be, but how it actually is. But I do believe that you could actually influence the outcome of what could happen in the future.
You certainly can.
So that being said...
With positive thinking.
Positive thinking, and try to think of the pros and try to make things go in your favor. And, of course, if you're thinking about what could happen, and that's what gets...
That's negative thinking. I think when you think what could happen, because you're thinking not a positive manner in that respect.
Well, you could be. I would say be cautious, but don't be fearful. Don't let fear paralyze you to the point where it's going to cause you to be either paralyzed or make mistakes. Because people who are fearful and anxious tend to make more mistakes because they're in a fearful state.
Right.
But if you are in a happy, confident state, the chances are you'll succeed at what you're doing, especially if it's something complicated.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for your input, and that leads me to think I'm doing the right thing, and I know I am. But it's nice to be validated every once in a while.
Once you start accomplishing your goals and you're realizing your greatest dreams, then you know you're on the right path.
Well, my wife thought I was totally crazy for spending as much time and money and effort to try to make the world a better place, a more civil, kinder place. But I'm going to go with Steve Jobs on this one. Steve Jobs once said, people who are crazy enough to think they can make a difference in the world are the ones that do. So with that said, I'm going to keep forging forward. I love talking to people like yourself that have the facts and figures. Like I say, I couldn't recount that date, even though you just told me it. I think it was May 23rd.
December 23rd.
December 23rd. What year?
1913.
1913. I'll try to remember that.
It's because Christmas was right around the corner.
Right. A great Christmas present for themselves. Let's control the money. Everyone, thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more of these fantastic interviews as I stop in at hostels and I visit the great wonders of the world. Be fantastic, everybody.